There are certain names that, the moment they are spoken, carry the weight of something far larger than a single individual. Names that represent not just a person, but a system, a failure, a reckoning. Jeffrey Edward Epstein is one of those names. He was a man who seemingly came from nowhere and built a fortune that no one could fully explain. He moved through the highest corridors of power with an ease that baffled observers. He dined with presidents. He flew with princes. He counted Nobel laureates and billionaires among his closest companions. His homes spanned from Manhattan to the Caribbean. His influence reached into the worlds of finance, science, politics, and philanthropy. And yet, beneath the polished surface of this extraordinary life, there existed a darkness so profound that when it was finally exposed, it shook the foundations of public trust in some of the most powerful institutions on earth. This is not a story about one man alone. It is a story about what happens when wealth becomes so vast and connections become so entangled that accountability itself seems to vanish. It is a story about how systems designed to protect the vulnerable can be bent, manipulated, and even broken by those with enough money and influence. And it is a story that, years after its central figure departed from the world, continues to raise questions that demand answers. To understand how Jeffrey Epstein became the figure we know today, we need to go back to the very beginning, to a modest neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York, where a boy with extraordinary ambition first began to dream of a life far beyond the world he was born into. Jeffrey Edward Epstein was born on January 20th, 1953, in the borough of Brooklyn, New York City. He grew up in a working-class neighborhood called Seagate, a small gated community situated at the western tip of Coney Island. It was a quiet, insular community, a place where families knew one another and where life moved at a pace dictated by routine, modesty, and the rhythms of the surrounding Atlantic coastline. His father, Seymour G. Epstein, worked for the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation. His mother, Pauline, was a homemaker and later worked as a school aide. The family was Jewish, and Jeffrey grew up alongside his younger brother, Mark. By all accounts, the Epsteins were a typical middle-class family. There was nothing in the household that would have predicted the extraordinary trajectory their eldest son would eventually follow. From an early age, however, Jeffrey displayed qualities that set him apart from many of his peers. He was remarkably intelligent. Teachers noted his aptitude for mathematics, a subject that seemed to come to him not with effort, but with a kind of natural fluency. Numbers made sense to him in ways they did not make sense to other children. He could see patterns, solve problems quickly, and think abstractly in a manner that was well beyond his years. But intelligence alone does not define a person. Those who knew the young Jeffrey Epstein also noted something else about him, an intense social ambition. He was charming, he was confident, and he seemed, even as a teenager, to understand that the world was organized around relationships, and that the ability to connect with the right people at the right time could open doors that talent alone could not. Epstein attended Lafayette High School in Brooklyn, where his academic performance was strong enough to earn him early attention. In fact, his intellectual abilities were so evident that he was able to skip 2 grades, graduating from high school at just 16 years old. This was no small feat in the late 1960s. Advancing ahead of one's class was a mark of genuine academic distinction, and it positioned the young Epstein as someone with considerable potential. Following high school, Epstein enrolled at Cooper Union, a prestigious college in Manhattan known for its rigorous programs in art, architecture, and engineering. However, he did not complete his degree there. He later attended the Courant Institute of Mathematical Sciences at New York University, where he took courses in mathematical physics. Again, he did not finish. He left without obtaining a formal degree. This is a detail worth pausing on, because it becomes one of the defining paradoxes of Jeffrey Epstein's life. Here was a man who would go on to manage the finances of billionaires, who would sit on the boards of prestigious institutions, who would be consulted by some of the most powerful people in the world, and yet he never earned a college degree. How he bridged the gap between a working-class upbringing in Brooklyn and the upper echelons of global wealth and power remains one of the most puzzling aspects of his biography. The answer, at least in part, lies in a remarkable opportunity that came his way in his early 20s, an opportunity that would become the first major stepping stone in his improbable ascent. In 1974, at the age of 21, Jeffrey Epstein secured a position that, given his lack of formal credentials, was nothing short of extraordinary. He was hired as a mathematics and physics teacher at the Dalton School, one of the most exclusive and prestigious private schools in New York City. Located on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, Dalton was the kind of institution where the children of the city's wealthiest and most influential families received their education. Tuition was steep, expectations were high, and the social network that surrounded the school was one of extraordinary privilege. How exactly Epstein obtained this position has been the subject of considerable discussion over the years. The man who hired him was Donald Barr, the headmaster of Dalton at the time, and, notably, the father of William Barr, who would later serve as Attorney General of the United States. Barr saw something in the young, degree-less Epstein, perhaps his obvious intelligence, perhaps his charisma, perhaps a combination of both. Epstein taught at Dalton for approximately 2 years. By several accounts, he was a capable teacher, engaging and knowledgeable. But his time at the school was significant for reasons that went beyond the classroom. At Dalton, Epstein was exposed to a world of wealth and social connection that he had never experienced before. He interacted with parents who were leaders in finance, law, media, and the arts. He observed, at close range, how the upper echelons of New York society operated, how relationships were cultivated, how doors were opened. It was during this period that Epstein appears to have made a critical decision about the direction of his life. Teaching, while intellectually satisfying, was not going to deliver the kind of life he envisioned for himself. He wanted more. He wanted wealth, influence, and access. In 1976, Epstein left Dalton and made a dramatic career change. He entered the world of finance, joining Bear Stearns, one of the most prominent investment banks on Wall Street. His entry into the firm was facilitated by a connection he had made through a parent at Dalton, Alan Ace Greenberg, who would later become the chairman and CEO of Bear Stearns. It was a pattern that would define Epstein's career, the ability to identify powerful individuals, cultivate relationships with them, and leverage those relationships into opportunities. At Bear Stearns, Epstein started in a relatively junior role, but he advanced quickly. His mathematical mind proved well-suited to the complexities of financial markets. He was adept at understanding risk, analyzing complex financial instruments, and identifying opportunities that others might overlook. Within just 4 years, he had risen to the position of limited partner, a remarkable achievement for someone with no formal financial training and no college degree. Colleagues at Bear Stearns described Epstein as brilliant, but also secretive. He was not the type to share his methods or his client list. He cultivated an air of mystery around his work, a quality that seemed to attract rather than repel the wealthy individuals he sought as clients. There was something about Epstein's combination of intelligence, confidence, and discretion that made extraordinarily rich people trust him with their money. In 1981, Epstein left Bear Stearns under circumstances that have never been fully clarified. Some reports suggest he was asked to leave following a regulatory issue, while others indicate he departed voluntarily to pursue his own ventures. Regardless of the precise circumstances, his departure from Bear Stearns marked the beginning of a new chapter, one in which Jeffrey Epstein would operate largely on his own terms, building a financial empire that was as opaque as it was impressive. After leaving Bear Stearns, Jeffrey Epstein established his own financial consulting firm. Initially, he called it Intercontinental Assets Group. Later, it became known as J. Epstein and Company, and eventually, the Financial Trust Company, which he based not on Wall Street, but in the U.S. Virgin Islands, a jurisdiction known for its favorable tax laws. From the outset, Epstein's business model was unusual. He reportedly set a minimum net worth requirement for his clients: $1 billion. This was an almost unheard-of threshold in the financial advisory world. By setting the bar so extraordinarily high, Epstein positioned himself not as a typical money manager, but as an exclusive financial strategist for the ultra-wealthy, a consigliere of sorts for people who already had more money than most could imagine. The most prominent among his known clients was Leslie Wexner, the billionaire founder of The Limited, a retail empire that included brands like Victoria's Secret, Bath & Body Works, and Abercrombie & Fitch. The relationship between Epstein and Wexner remains one of the most scrutinized and least understood connections in Epstein's story. Wexner granted Epstein sweeping power over his financial affairs, including power of attorney, a level of trust that was extraordinary by any standard. Through this relationship, Epstein gained control of significant assets, including a $71 million Manhattan townhouse, one of the largest private residences in New York City, which Wexner transferred to an Epstein-controlled entity. But the precise nature and full extent of Epstein's financial operations have never been entirely transparent. Unlike most major financial managers, Epstein did not register with the Securities and Exchange Commission. He did not have a large team of analysts or traders. His firm operated with a skeleton crew, and the details of his investment strategies, his client list, and his sources of income were closely guarded secrets. This opacity fueled curiosity and, eventually, suspicion. How did a college dropout from Brooklyn come to control hundreds of millions of dollars? Who were his clients? What exactly did he do for them? These questions swirled around Epstein for decades, and satisfactory answers were never fully provided. What was visible, however, was the lifestyle, and it was extraordinary. Epstein's primary residence was the aforementioned mansion on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, a massive 9-story townhouse on East 71st Street, one of the most expensive addresses in the world. He owned a sprawling estate in Palm Beach, Florida, a property valued at tens of millions of dollars. He maintained a ranch in New Mexico called Zorro Ranch, spanning thousands of acres of pristine desert landscape. He owned a private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands known as Little St. James, where he built an elaborate compound. He possessed a fleet of luxury vehicles, a private Boeing 727, and later a Gulfstream jet. The private jet, which became infamous in later years, was the vehicle through which Epstein maintained his most important asset, his social network. He flew constantly, and his passenger manifests read like a directory of global power. Over the years, Epstein was photographed, documented, or credibly reported to have associated with a remarkable cross-section of influential individuals. These included political leaders, members of royal families, acclaimed scientists, celebrated academics, technology moguls, entertainment figures, and leaders of major financial institutions. Epstein cultivated these relationships with deliberate strategy. He hosted elaborate dinners at his Manhattan residence, gatherings where a Nobel Prize-winning physicist might find themselves seated next to a sitting senator, a tech billionaire, or a renowned artist. He positioned himself as a connector, a man who could bring together people from vastly different worlds. He also positioned himself as a philanthropist, donating to scientific research, educational institutions, and various charitable causes. He served on boards and advisory councils. He funded research at Harvard University and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, among other institutions. To the outside world, Jeffrey Epstein appeared to be a brilliant, if unconventional, financier, a self-made man who had parlayed his mathematical genius into a fortune and who used that fortune to support the advancement of knowledge. He was mysterious, certainly. He was eccentric, undoubtedly. But he was, in the eyes of many who knew him socially, a fascinating and generous figure. This image, however, was about to be shattered. The first significant cracks in Jeffrey Epstein's carefully constructed public persona began to appear in the early 2000s, though whispers and concerns had existed long before that. What would eventually become one of the most consequential criminal cases in modern American history began not with a dramatic investigation or a high-profile whistleblower, but with something far more ordinary, a complaint from a parent. In March 2005, a woman in Palm Beach, Florida, contacted the local police department. Her stepdaughter, a minor at the time, had disclosed that she had been brought to Epstein's Palm Beach estate and had been subjected to inappropriate conduct. The Palm Beach Police Department opened an investigation, and what they began to uncover was deeply troubling. As investigators spoke with more individuals, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Multiple young women, many of whom had been minors at the time of the alleged incidents, described being recruited through a network of intermediaries. The recruitment often followed a consistent pattern. A young woman would be approached, often by another young woman, and offered money to visit Epstein's home for what was described as providing massage services. Once inside the residence, the encounters allegedly escalated beyond anything the victims had consented to or anticipated. The Palm Beach police conducted a thorough investigation, ultimately identifying what they believed to be a significant number of victims. The police chief at the time, Michael Ryder, became so frustrated with what he perceived as a lack of urgency from the local state attorney's office that he took the unusual step of referring the case directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The FBI opened its own investigation, and the case was referred to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Florida, then headed by Alexander Acosta. What followed would become one of the most controversial chapters in the history of American criminal justice. In 2007, after extensive investigation, Epstein's legal team, which included some of the most prominent and expensive defense attorneys in the country, entered into negotiations with federal prosecutors. The result was a plea agreement that stunned many observers and outraged the victims. In June 2008, Epstein pleaded guilty to 2 state charges in Florida: 1 count of solicitation of a minor for involvement in inappropriate conduct, and 1 count of procurement of a minor for similar purposes. Under the terms of the agreement, Epstein was sentenced to 18 months in the Palm Beach County Stockade. He was required to register as a convicted offender, but the conditions of his incarceration were unlike anything most convicted individuals experience. Epstein was granted a work release program that allowed him to leave the jail facility for up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, to work from a comfortable office in downtown West Palm Beach. His cell was in a private wing of the facility. The arrangement bore little resemblance to what most people would recognize as imprisonment. Perhaps even more controversially, the plea agreement included a non-prosecution agreement, or NPA, that granted immunity not only to Epstein but also to any potential co-conspirators, some of whom were named in the agreement and some of whom were not. The agreement was negotiated largely in secret, and the victims were not informed of its terms before it was finalized, a fact that would later be found to be in violation of the Crime Victims' Rights Act by a federal judge. Epstein was released from custody in 2009 after serving approximately 13 months of his 18-month sentence. He resumed his life largely as before, though his status as a registered offender now followed him publicly. Despite this conviction, Epstein continued to maintain many of his social connections, and his lifestyle appeared to change very little. The 2008 plea deal would hang over the case like a dark cloud for more than a decade. It became a focal point of criticism directed at the justice system and at the specific prosecutors who had negotiated it. Many observers, legal experts, and, most importantly, the victims themselves viewed the outcome as a profound failure of justice, a case in which an individual's wealth and connections had effectively shielded him from appropriate legal consequences. For years after the Florida plea deal, the story of Jeffrey Epstein simmered beneath the surface of public consciousness. It was known within certain circles, discussed by investigative journalists, and quietly pursued by attorneys representing the victims. But it had not yet captured the full attention of the broader public. That began to change in earnest in November 2018, when the Miami Herald published a landmark investigative series titled Perversion of Justice, written by reporter Julie K. Brown. The series was the product of years of meticulous reporting. Brown tracked down and interviewed dozens of women who identified themselves as victims of Epstein. She examined court documents, legal filings, and the details of the 2008 plea agreement with a level of scrutiny that had not previously been applied by any major news organization. The impact of the series was seismic. It brought the Epstein case back into the national spotlight and generated a wave of public outrage. The reporting raised pointed questions about how the original plea deal had been negotiated, who had been involved in the decision-making process, and whether powerful individuals had intervened to secure a favorable outcome for Epstein. It also gave a platform to the voices of the victims, many of whom had felt silenced and ignored for over a decade. The political ramifications were immediate. Alexander Acosta, who had overseen the 2008 plea agreement and who was now serving as the United States Secretary of Labor in the Trump administration, faced intense scrutiny. He held a press conference in July 2019 to defend his handling of the case, but public pressure continued to mount, and he ultimately resigned from his cabinet position. The Herald's reporting also prompted renewed legal action. On July 6, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was arrested by federal agents at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey after returning from a trip to Paris. He was charged by the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York with 2 counts, one of trafficking in minors and one of conspiracy to engage in trafficking of minors. The indictment alleged that between 2002 and 2005, Epstein had operated a vast network through which he had exploited dozens of young women, many of whom were under the age of 18. The arrest was a watershed moment. It signaled that the federal government was prepared to take a far more aggressive approach to the case than it had in 2008. The charges carried the possibility of up to 45 years in prison. Epstein pleaded not guilty to all charges and was denied bail. In his bail hearing, prosecutors argued that he posed an extreme flight risk, citing his vast wealth, his multiple residences, his private aircraft, and evidence that he had paid potential witnesses substantial sums of money in attempts to influence their cooperation with investigators. The judge agreed and ordered Epstein to be held at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan, a federal detention facility known for housing high-profile inmates. The case generated an extraordinary level of public interest. Every court appearance, every legal filing, and every new revelation was covered extensively by media outlets around the world. The names associated with Epstein, the places he had visited, the people he had entertained, all came under intense public scrutiny. Institutions that had accepted his donations faced pressure to return the money or account for their associations with him. Universities, research organizations, and nonprofit groups all found themselves forced to confront uncomfortable questions about their relationships with the disgraced financier. For the victims, the 2019 arrest represented something they had fought for and waited for through years of frustration and disappointment. Many came forward publicly for the first time, sharing their stories with media outlets and filing civil lawsuits. Their courage in speaking out became one of the most powerful elements of the entire saga. The Epstein case was not merely an American story. It resonated around the world, in part because Epstein's network of associations had been genuinely global, and in part because the themes it raised, the abuse of power, the failure of institutions, the vulnerability of young people, are universal concerns. In the United Kingdom, the case drew particular attention because of Epstein's documented friendship with Prince Andrew, the Duke of York. The two had been photographed together on multiple occasions over many years, and Epstein had been a guest at royal residences. After Epstein's arrest and subsequent death, public pressure mounted on Prince Andrew to address his association with a convicted offender. In November 2019, Prince Andrew gave a now infamous interview to BBC Newsnight, in which he discussed his relationship with Epstein. The interview was widely regarded as a public relations disaster. The Duke's responses were perceived by many as lacking empathy for the victims and as failing to adequately explain his continued association with Epstein after the 2008 conviction. The fallout was swift and severe. Prince Andrew stepped back from his public duties as a member of the royal family, and his reputation sustained damage that has proven lasting. In early 2022, Virginia Giuffre, one of the most prominent individuals to accuse Epstein and his associates of misconduct, filed a civil lawsuit against Prince Andrew. The case was settled out of court, with Andrew making a substantial financial payment to Jeffrey and to a charity supporting victims' rights. In the settlement, Andrew did not admit to any wrongdoing. But the terms of the agreement and the surrounding publicity represented a significant moment in the broader accountability process. The international dimension of the story extended beyond the British royal family. Investigations and reporting revealed connections between Epstein and influential figures across multiple countries. The French authorities opened their own investigation into activities alleged to have taken place on French soil. Israeli media explored Epstein's connections to figures in that country. The scope of his network seemed, at times, almost impossibly vast. Media coverage of the case was relentless and came in many forms. Traditional investigative journalism, including the Miami Herald's foundational reporting, was supplemented by documentary films, podcasts, books, and television specials. Netflix released a 4-part documentary series titled Jeffrey Epstein, Filthy Rich in 2020, which featured extensive interviews with survivors and became one of the platform's most watched documentary programs. Lifetime, Investigation Discovery, and other networks produced their own examinations of the case. Podcasts dedicated to the Epstein story attracted millions of listeners. The sheer volume of media attention reflected something deeper than mere curiosity. The Epstein case had become a prism through which the public examined larger questions about justice, privilege, and accountability. It became a reference point in conversations about the ways in which wealth can distort legal outcomes, about the responsibilities of those who associate with powerful individuals, and about the societal structures that can allow exploitation to persist unchecked for years. The period following Epstein's July 2019 arrest was marked by intense legal maneuvering, public fascination, and a pervasive sense that the case was building toward a reckoning that had been delayed for far too long. Inside the Metropolitan Correctional Center, Epstein was held under conditions that reflected both the seriousness of the charges against him and the perceived risk that he might attempt to harm himself. On July 23, 2019, approximately 2 weeks after his arrest, Epstein was found in his cell in a state of distress with marks on his neck. The incident was classified as a possible attempt at self-harm, and he was placed on suicide watch, a protocol that involves heightened monitoring, removal of potentially dangerous items, and regular checks by correctional staff. However, after approximately 6 days on suicide watch, Epstein was removed from the enhanced monitoring protocol. The decision to take him off suicide watch was later the subject of intense scrutiny and criticism. Questions were raised about who made the decision, what criteria were used, and whether the protocols in place at the facility were adequate. During this period, Epstein's legal team continued to prepare for what would have been a landmark trial. The case was attracting enormous resources on both sides. Federal prosecutors were building what they described as a comprehensive case, supported by extensive documentary evidence, financial records, and victim testimony. Epstein's defense team, meanwhile, included some of the most experienced criminal defense attorneys in the country. The public waited for a trial that many hoped would bring not only accountability for Epstein, but also transparency about the broader network that had enabled his activities. There was widespread anticipation that a trial would reveal names, details, and connections that had remained hidden for years. That trial never came. On the morning of August 10, 2019, Jeffrey Edward Epstein was found unresponsive in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan. Emergency medical personnel were called, and Epstein was transported to New York Presbyterian Lower Manhattan Hospital, where he was pronounced dead. He was 66 years old. The New York City office of the chief medical examiner conducted an autopsy and determined the cause of death to be suicide by hanging. This was the official determination, and it was supported by the physical evidence collected during the examination. The reaction to Epstein's death was immediate and intense. For the victims and their advocates, it was a devastating blow. The possibility of a public trial, of a full accounting of Epstein's activities, of a moment of formal justice, had been extinguished. Many of the women who had waited years for their day in court expressed profound grief and frustration. The death robbed them of the opportunity to face their abuser in a courtroom and to see him held accountable through the legal process they had fought so hard to initiate. The circumstances surrounding the death also raised serious questions about the management of the Metropolitan Correctional Center. Subsequent investigations revealed a cascade of failures at the facility. 2 correctional officers who had been assigned to monitor Epstein's unit were found to have failed to conduct required checks on the night of his death. The officers, who were later charged with falsifying records, had reportedly fallen asleep and browsed the internet during their shifts rather than performing the mandated rounds. Additionally, the surveillance cameras in the area near Epstein's cell malfunctioned or failed to capture usable footage, a failure that compounded the sense of institutional breakdown. The 2 officers ultimately entered into plea agreements with federal prosecutors, avoiding prison time in exchange for completing community service and cooperating with ongoing investigations. The warden of the Metropolitan Correctional Center was reassigned. The facility itself, already under scrutiny for chronic understaffing and poor conditions, became a symbol of the broader dysfunction within the Federal Bureau of Prisons. In fact, the Metropolitan Correctional Center was permanently closed in 2021, though the closure was attributed to a range of factors beyond the Epstein case alone. Attorney General William Barr described the circumstances surrounding Epstein's death as a perfect storm of screw-ups and stated that the Justice Department's investigation had found no evidence of foul play. The determination of suicide was upheld by the medical examiner's office, and subsequent reviews did not alter this finding. Nevertheless, Epstein's death without trial left a profound void. It meant that the full scope of his activities, the identities of all those who may have participated in or facilitated his conduct, might never be fully established through a criminal proceeding. This void fueled widespread public frustration and underscored the sense that the Epstein case represented a systemic failure at multiple levels. Jeffrey Epstein's death did not end the legal or public reckoning associated with his case. In many ways, it intensified it. In the months and years that followed, a number of significant legal proceedings moved forward. Perhaps the most prominent of these was the federal case against Ghislaine Maxwell, a British socialite who had been one of Epstein's closest associates for decades. Maxwell was arrested by the FBI on July 2, 2020, at a property in Bradford, New Hampshire, where she had been living in relative seclusion. Maxwell was charged with multiple counts related to her alleged role in recruiting and grooming young women for Epstein between 1994 and 2004. The charges included enticement of a minor, transportation of a minor with intent to engage in criminal activity, and conspiracy to commit these offenses. An additional charge of perjury was also included, related to statements Maxwell had made in earlier depositions. Maxwell pleaded not guilty to all charges. Her trial, which took place in the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York in late 2021, was one of the most closely watched legal proceedings of the year. Over the course of several weeks, prosecutors presented testimony from 4 women who described, in their own words, how they had been recruited as teenagers and subjected to exploitation with Maxwell's direct involvement and facilitation. On December 29, 2021, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on 5 of 6 counts. Ghislaine Maxwell was subsequently sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. The conviction was seen by many as a measure of accountability, though it was also widely acknowledged that it represented only a partial reckoning with the broader network of enablers and participants that had surrounded Epstein. Beyond the Maxwell trial, numerous civil lawsuits were filed by Epstein's victims against his estate, against individuals alleged to have been complicit in his activities, and against institutions that had associated with him. The Epstein Victims Compensation Program, established by the estate's executors, distributed over $120 million to more than 150 claimants. While no amount of money could undo the harm that had been done, The program represented an acknowledgement of the suffering the victims had endured. Investigations also continued at the institutional level. J.P. Morgan Chase and Deutsche Bank, both of which had maintained banking relationships with Epstein, faced lawsuits and regulatory scrutiny. In 2023, J.P. Morgan Chase agreed to pay $290 million to settle a class action lawsuit brought by Epstein's victims, who alleged that the bank had facilitated Epstein's activities by maintaining his accounts despite clear warning signs. Deutsche Bank had previously agreed to a $150 million settlement with the New York State Department of Financial Services, which found that the bank had failed to properly monitor Epstein's account activity. Universities and research institutions also faced a reckoning. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology conducted an internal review of its financial relationship with Epstein and found that the institution had accepted approximately $800,000 in donations from him, some of which had been accepted even after his 2008 conviction. MIT's president issued a public apology. The director of the MIT Media Lab, Joy Ito, resigned after it was revealed that he had cultivated a closer relationship with Epstein than had been previously disclosed and had accepted funds on behalf of the lab from Epstein and Epstein-directed sources. Harvard University similarly faced scrutiny for donations it had received, and several other institutions were forced to confront their own associations with the disgraced financier. In late 2023 and into 2024, additional legal developments continued to generate public attention. Court orders resulted in the release of previously sealed documents from a 2015 civil lawsuit filed by Virginia Giuffre against Ghislaine Maxwell. These documents contained depositions, flight logs, and other records that named numerous individuals associated with Epstein. While the release of these documents did not constitute evidence of wrongdoing by the individuals named, the disclosures intensified public debate about the full extent of Epstein's network and the question of whether others who may have been involved in or aware of his activities would ever face legal consequences. And above all, it is a story about the survivors. The women who came forward, who shared the most painful experiences of their lives with investigators, journalists, and eventually the public, displayed a courage that stands as the most significant element of this entire saga. Many of them were dismissed, ignored, or actively discouraged from pursuing justice for years. Many faced retaliation, intimidation, and the overwhelming weight of opposing a man with virtually unlimited resources. And yet they persisted. Their testimony, their resilience, and their refusal to be silenced ultimately brought about the legal and institutional consequences that followed. The Epstein case has also had a lasting impact on broader cultural and legal conversations. It has contributed to evolving discussions about the obligations of institutions to monitor and vet their donors and associates. It has influenced legislative efforts to strengthen protections for victims and to reform the handling of similar cases within the criminal justice system. And it has served as a stark reminder that wealth and social status do not and should not place any individual above the law. When we look back at the life and crimes of Jeffrey Epstein, we are confronted with a series of uncomfortable truths. We are reminded that exploitation can hide behind the most polished facades. We are reminded that the systems we trust to protect the vulnerable are only as strong as the individuals who operate them and the institutions that oversee them. And we are reminded that justice, while sometimes delayed, is most often achieved not through the actions of the powerful, but through the persistence of those who refuse to accept injustice. Jeffrey Epstein is gone. He will never stand trial. He will never face a jury of his peers. He will never hear a judge pronounce a sentence commensurate with the scale of harm he inflicted. That absence of a full legal reckoning is a wound that will never fully heal for many of his victims. But the story does not end with him. It continues in the ongoing legal proceedings against those who enabled him. It continues in the reforms being implemented at institutions that were touched by his influence. It continues in the work of advocates and organizations dedicated to protecting young people from exploitation. And it continues in the broader societal conversation about what it means to hold the powerful accountable. The question that lingers, the question that this story ultimately poses to all of us, is not simply about one man. It is about the kind of society we choose to be. It is about whether we are willing to confront uncomfortable truths, even when they implicate people and institutions we might prefer to trust. It is about whether we believe that justice should be applied equally, regardless of wealth, status, or connections. And it is about whether we are prepared to listen to the voices of those who have been harmed, even when listening is difficult, even when the truth is painful, even when the powerful would prefer silence. The story of Jeffrey Epstein is a mirror. What we see in it depends on what we are willing to look at. And the choices we make in response, as a society, as institutions, as individuals, will determine whether the lessons of this tragedy lead to meaningful change or fade into the noise of history. The survivors have spoken. The record is clear. The question now is whether we will truly hear them.